What's going on, everybody? Mortym here, this time bringing you my general pros and cons of the Templar class. Now, much like all of my other classes, I'm going to actually be going through all of the skills for each of the 3 class-specific skill lines each class has, and then I'm going to be talking about the general pros and cons that I've found while playing it. If you want to jump ahead to that part, I'm going to leave a timestamp down below. So, let's jump right into it. Aedric Spear, jumping into the passives here. Piercing Spear, which increases critical damage done and your damage against blocking targets by 10% if you have an Aedric Spear ability slotted. Spear Wall increases the damage you can block from melee attacks with an Aedric Spear ability slotted by 15%. And then we have Burning Light and Balanced Warrior down here. Now, both of these combined are what make Templar's really good stamina DPS. So Burning Light, when you deal damage with an Aedric Spear ability, you have a 25% chance to deal an additional 4,000 physical, which is variable, or magic damage, whichever is higher. So depending on if you're a Magplar or stamina based, you're going to be doing that particular type of damage, and it can occur once every 0.5 seconds. And then we have Balanced Warrior, which increases our weapon damage by 6% and our spell resistance by 2640. So, coming up here to the actual abilities, for the ultimate, at its base we have Radial Sweep. Swing an Aedric Spear in front of you, does 6,600 magic damage and an additional amount of damage every 2 seconds, similar to Dawnbreaker from the Fighters Guild line. So if we go into morphs, we have Empowering Sweep, which at its base, when we hit, it'll also reduce damage done to us by 15%, plus an additional 4% for each enemy hit. So tanks could definitely pick that up, that would be useful. And then we have, of course, Crescent Sweep, which deals physical damage and deals additional damage to enemies in front of you, specifically 66% in the that are actually physically in front of your character. This is great for stamina DPS. Definitely brings the damage more in line with bigger abilities like Flawless Dawnbreaker and things like that. So, moving on to the individual abilities for Aedric Spear, we have Puncturing Strikes, which at its base, launch a Relentless Assault, striking enemies in front of you 4 times with your Aedric Spear, and then the closest enemy takes 140% additional damage each strike, and their movement speed is reduced by 70 for 2 seconds on the final hit. So essentially what this is a super powered version of Biting Jabs from the Dual Wield skill line. Now, that's important to note because when I say it's super powered, I mean it's super powered. Now, if you read that, launching a Relentless Assault, striking enemies in front of you 4 times. So you'll have that 8x5 meter up here, if you can see it above the magic across there. 8.5, 8 times 5 meters in front of you is the area that'll actually hit. So it's going to hit several enemies, which Biting Jabs doesn't do. It only, not Biting Jabs, rather. I forget what it's called. Rapid Strikes from the Dual Wield skill line. There's the name of it. That's only going to hit 1 target, whereas this will already hit several. The closest enemy to you in that range will take 140% additional damage, plus they're going to get slowed on the final hit. So it does a crap ton just by itself. That's the unmorphed version. So coming over here to Biting Jabs, which was the name I was thinking of earlier, it converts it to stamina, which means if you're running stamina, it's going to be doing way more damage because now it's not based off magicka, it's a stamina ability. And it's also going to give us increased weapon critical for 8 seconds. Specifically, it's going to give us Major Savagery. And that's awesome because if you pick up this, you don't have to use things like Evil Hunter or Camouflage Hunter from the Fighters Guild or anything else that would give you weapon critical because, Biting Jabs is going to give it to you. And then for the other one, we have Puncturing Sweep, which also heals us for a percentage, similar to Bloodthirst, which is what Rapid Strikes turns into. One of its morphs. So, as you can see, this is basically just a straight upgrade from that, especially if you're dual wielding. There's no reason not to use this. Because it's a class ability, you can, of course, use it with any weapon. Moving on, though, we have Piercing Javelin. You hurl a spear with godlike strength, dealing magic damage, stunning them, and knocking them back. So, the 2 morphs are Aurora Javelin, which deals additional damage based on distance the spear travels. And then we have Binding Javelin, which converts it to a stamina ability and stuns for long. You will see both of these morphs used a lot in PvP. This is a very popular PvP ability. Then we have Focus Charge, charged with your Divine Lance to impale an enemy, dealing so much magic damage. If an enemy hit is casting, they're interrupted and stunned for 3 seconds. And then the 2 morphs are, one of them, is Explosive Charge, which deals damage and interrupts all enemies near the point of impact. So essentially you go from damaging one enemy to all enemies within an area there. And then we have Toppling Charge, which guarantees the enemy is stunned regardless of if they're casting, and also sets them off balance, which is useful for some builds because, for instance, there are champion points that give bonus damage to enemies that are off balance, so you could take that into account with like a Magicka build. And then from there we have Spear Shards. At its base, you shatter a spear. Essentially, it does magical damage to everything around you. They take a damage over time as long as they're standing in it. But more importantly, while active, an ally can activate Blessed Shards, which will restore Magicka or Stamina. And then the two morph versions are Luminous Shards, which the synergy grants additional resource for Luminous, and a Blazing Spear increases the damage over time. If you see Magplar, sometimes they'll use Blazing Spear because you get a nice dot out of it, whereas healers use Luminous Shards a lot because of the synergy to give resources. That's pretty much the only real uses for it. As Stamina, which is mostly what I play, I almost never use this. So, moving on to Sun Shield. Surround yourself with solar rays, granting a damage shield equal to 30% of your max health for 6 seconds. And nearby enemies take so much magic damage when the shield is activated, increasing the shield's strength by 4% for each one hit. Now from there we have Radiant Ward, which will reduce the cost, and the shield is strengthened by 6% for each enemy hit. Or Blazing Shield, which it'll no longer deal damage, but when the shield expires or is broken through, essentially, then it deals its damage. So, all of that said, not a huge fan of Sun Shield or its morphs. I mean, it's just to me. Like, I don't really care for it because a lot of times there's just better ways to go, especially with the wards. I mean, yeah, sure, a tank might as well pick it up, because 30% of their max health is a very significant amount of health. However, for anybody lower than that, there's not much of a point, because if you're surrounded by so many enemies enough to actually get a good benefit off of the increased strength that you get from that, like, you're probably just going to die anyway, no matter how many times you activate this. So just something to keep in mind. And moving on to Dawn's Wrath. This is where we get a lot of our Magicka abilities from. They do have some various uses, though. So jumping down to passes, we have Enduring Rays, which increase the duration of 3 of the abilities. We have Prism, which casting a Dawn's Wrath ability generates 3 ultimate once every 6 seconds. Then we have Illuminate, which will casting a Dawn's Wrath ability grants minor sorcery to you and your group, increasing spell damage by 5%. And Restoring Spirit, which reduces Magicka stamina and ultimate costs by 4%, which is awesome. Now moving up to the ultimate ability. At its base we have Nova, call down a fragment of the sun to the target area, dealing so much magic damage each second to enemies, and applying Major Maim, reducing their damage done by 30%, and an ally can activate Supernova, dealing so much extra damage to all enemies in an area and stunning them. Now its morphs are Solar Prism and Solar Disturbance. Now Solar Prism, allies may activate a more powerful synergy. As you can see, our damage jumped up from 7.5k to 13k. And then for Solar Disturbance, it also reduces movement speed of enemies in the target area. Magicka builds use this occasionally, but something a lot of people don't think of is things like tanks will sometimes use this, Templar tanks, because of all the Major Maim that it applies to everybody, reducing their damage done. Plus the synergy that they can use, dealing a crap ton of damage as well as stunning everything around you. So it's a pretty good tank ultimate as well, Solar Prism specifically. Solar Disturbance also, but I mean that's definitely more of a PvP focused thing, as that's the only time it's really important to reduce movement speed. You don't necessarily need a lot of that in PvE situations. Now moving on to the abilities, we have Sunfire. Sunfire, you blast an enemy with a charge of Radiant Heat, deals flame damage and a dot over time, as well as giving you spell critical when you activate it. And then its 2 morphs are Vampire's Bane, which the dot lasts longer, and Reflective Light, which will split the projectile, allowing it to affect 2 additional nearby enemies. Pretty solid Magicka build move. I mean, you'll see it there occasionally. There are Destruction Staff things that I feel are a little better than this, but this kind of takes the cake because it gives you that extra spell critical, again, which allows you to replace things like Inner Light with a damage ability. Inner Light being a spell critical slotted thing from the Mage's Guild skill line, if you're unaware. Now moving on to Solar Flare. With a 1.1 second cast time, you can conjure a ball of solar energy to deal so much magic damage, which also grants you Empower, increasing the damage of your next attack by 20%. Then we have Dark Flare and Solar Barrage. Dark Flare also applies Major Defile to the target and nearby enemies, reducing their healing received by 30%. And then we have Solar Barrage, which takes the cast time away but deals less damage and actually hits enemies around you instead, but still grants the Empower. Now, Solar Barrage is kind of meh. You don't really see that a lot. You will see Dark Flare a lot in PvP. With the Empower, this is actually similar to a Magicka version of Wrecking Blow off of the two-handed skill line. And you'll notice that's kind of a theme with the Templar abilities. A lot of their abilities are almost just straight upgrades from weapon skill abilities. Now, again, Dark Flare you'll see a lot in PvP, but this is all Magicka based, so if you're not using a Magicka build, you're probably not going to use this one. So, then we have Backlash. We summon an expanding beam of pure sunlight to damage an enemy for so much magic damage, then copying all of their damage taken and releasing it as 20%, releasing 20% of it as additional Magicka, and as you can see, the damage caps out at a certain point. So then we have Purifying Light, which, when the effect ends, a pool of sunlight remains, which will heal nearby enemies. And then you have Power of the Light, which changes it to a stamina ability and deals physical damage, and also applies Minor Fracture and Minor Breach, reducing their physical, which makes it easier to hit the cap. And as you can see, the Power of the Light cap is way higher than the Magicka cap. So Purifying Light, you'll see healers use it sometime because of the health thing, but the one you'll see a lot is Power of the Light. Most stamina Templar builds will use this in some form or another. So from there we have Eclipse. Eclipse envelop an enemy in a lightless sphere, reflecting any harmful projectile they cast back at them, and you also place magnetic energy at the target, which explodes, which deals magic damage. Now that last part's important because they added it, because if you use this on bosses, they're just immune to the whole effect. It does nothing. Then that gets replaced with Total Dark, which you'll healed for each spell that's reflected, or Unstable Core, which no longer reflects the spell, but instead the explosion does way more damage. So if you're going to see this, it'll probably be the Unstable Core on a Magicka build, because the Total Dark version and the Eclipse version, a lot of boss enemies are just straight up immune to the majority of that effect, and the damage is so negligible, there's just no point. Magicka abilities can do pretty well with Unstable Core, or Magicka builds rather, but that's about it. So from there we have Radiant Destruction. Burn an enemy with a ray of Holy Fire. This is channeled over 2.8 seconds, that's worth noting, and deals up to 3 times that damage to enemies below 50% health. Then we have Radiant Glory, which will heal you for a percentage of the damage inflicted. And then we have Radiant Oppression, which will deal more damage in proportion to your current Magicka. I assume if you have less, it does more damage, but it doesn't actually say. So, again, pretty big, heavy-hitting Magicka build type thing. Because it's all Magicka, you won't really see this for stamina. I don't imagine tanks use it for anything, so it's definitely more of a Magicka DPS thing. Then moving on to Restoring Light, which is the Templar's healing tree. So the only other class to even have a healing tree is the Warden, and while the Warden beats them in straight up heals, a lot of these heals have pretty good utility. So their passives are Mending, which increases healing effects from Restoring Light abilities by up to 12% in proportion to the severity of the target's wounds. So basically, if they're hurt more, it can deal up to 12% extra healing. Then we have Sacred Ground. While standing in your own cleansing ritual, rune focus, or rite of passage, area of effects, and for 4 seconds after leaving them, you gain minor mending, increasing your healing done by 8%. Enemies standing in your cleansing ritual or any of those other abilities mentioned have their movement speed reduced. Then we have Light Weaver, which provides specific bonuses for individual abilities. Restoring Aura will last 20% longer, Healing Ritual grants 2 ultimate to allies healing 60% health, and Channeling Rite of Passage grants you a crap ton of physical and spell resistance. Then we have Master Ritualist, which actually increases resurrection speed by 20%. Resurrected allies return with 100% more health, and gives you a 50% chance to fill an empty soul gem after each successful resurrection. That is a very unique passive, specifically to the Templars, which basically makes resurrecting people during a fight way easier. So, then we have their ultimate, which is Rite of Passage. Channel the Grace of the Gods, healing you and your nearby allies for a crap ton of health every 1 second for 4 seconds, but you cannot move, but you will gain immunity to all disabling effects. So basically you're rooted to the ground, but nothing can actually like knock you out of the channel. Then we have Remembrance, which will essentially make sure that you take less damage, specifically 30% less. And then there is Practiced Incantation, which will increase the duration of the channel to 6 seconds up from 4 seconds. Now we have, for the active abilities, Rush Ceremony, beacon your inner light, healing yourself or a wounded ally in front of you for 4.4 or however much it scales for you. Then its 2 morphs are Honor the Dead and Breath of Life. Honor the Dead will refund part of the ability's cost when used to heal an injured target, which is, most anybody, mind you. And then Breath of Life also heals one other injured target for half the amount. So instead of healing just you or one wounded ally, it heals, one more person for half. It's okay. So Healing Ritual, force your spiritual devotion, healing you and nearby allies for so much health. Ritual of Rebirth is one of the morphs. You heal a single ally outside the ability's radius for an additional amount, half. And then there's Hasty Prayer. You can move at full speed. This is a 1.5 second cast time ability, and you'll basically move the normal speed as opposed to slowing down when you cast this. And then we have Restoring Aura. Champion the cause of divine glory to apply minor Magicka Steel to all enemies around you for 18 seconds, giving you and your allies Magicka when you damage the enemy you're hitting with Magicka Steel on. While slotted, you gain all of those effects, which effectively increase health, stamina, and Magicka recovery by 10%. Now, the 2 morphs are Radiant Aura, which increases the radius of that. And then we have Repentance, which changes the skill entirely. It no longer does the Magicka Steel thing, but instead you consume corpses to restore health and stamina. And you'll also notice that this costs absolutely nothing when you convert it to Repentance. Now, this is awesome. You'll see this everywhere. A lot of people use Repentance, and that's because it's awesome. Because every time you kill something, you can just activate this for free, instantaneously, get health and stamina back. So as long as you can keep killing this thing, you can keep yourself up, you can keep your resource regeneration handled. Of course, you'll lose that effect a bit on bosses, so you'll still need some sustainability in that regard. But if you're up against a lot of enemies, there's no way you're going to lose all your resources here. Now, from there we have Cleansing Ritual. Exalt in the sacred light of the Aedric, cleansing up to 2 harmful effects from yourself, and healing you and nearby allies for a small amount for 2 seconds every 12 seconds, or every 2 seconds for 12 seconds. And then allies can actually activate the Purify synergy, removing all harmful effects from them and healing them as well. You'll see healers use this one a lot. Now then we have Ritual of Retribution, which will increase the healing and also damages enemies in the effect. And then you have Extended Ritual, which will increase the duration and the amount of harmful effects that you cleanse from yourself, 5, from 2 to 5, so quite a bit. Pretty awesome ability. Sometimes if you want a little bit of extra heal and you don't want to use Vigor, while Vigor will 100% heal more than this, this will also damage enemies as well. So if you're not in a huge heal-heavy situation, you can use like Restoring Aura and Ritual of Retribution to kind of heal up. And then from there we have Rune Focus. Rune Focus by itself create a rune of celestial protection, which defends you while you stand in it, and for 8 seconds after you leave it. It is worth noting that this is actually pretty small. Now, the 2 morphs here are Channeled Focus, Channeled Focus will reduce the cost, and the rune also recovers Magicka. And then Restoring Focus, the rune also grants minor vitality and minor protection, increasing healing received and reducing your damage taken. Great for tank abilities, obviously. So you'll definitely see tanks use this a lot, but the problem is if you have to move around a lot, it is a fairly small area, as you can see. I mean, it's just basically the immediate area you're in. Now, it does last for 8 seconds afterwards, but if you're in a boss fight where you have to move a lot, I mean, I wouldn't expect it to be all that great. But, the 8 seconds might be able to help you out if you can run in and out of it or something like that. Either way, you see tanks use that one quite often. Now, so from going into there to just the straight up pros and cons, The things I wanted to talk about. So, obviously, as one of the only two classes that actually even has a healing tree, they make great healers. They really do. The problem is Wardens are just better at it in terms of straight up heals. Now, the thing about Templars that's still pretty nice is while Warden definitely beats them in just straight up healing power, the Templars heals usually have a lot more utility to them. You know, purging effects, adding extra damage to them, the Magicka Steel thing that you can do. So with those things, they just have a bit more utility than the Warden's heals, which tend to be just straight up crazy powerful heals. So like, you'll heal an insane amount of damage, which is awesome, of course, but Templars a lot of times provide a lot of utility, and because of that, they're still pretty popular in that regard. So as stamina DPS, because of those two abilities that I mentioned, passives, Burning Light and Balanced Warrior, which increases weapon damage, and then also gives you an extra 25% chance to basically just deal like 4k extra damage, 4 or 5k once you're maxed out, every 0.5 seconds. You'll do a crap ton of damage as a Stamina Templar, and because a lot of your abilities, your class abilities, will just replace straight up weapon abilities because they're just better in general, it's really easy to be a Stamina DPS with a Templar because so many of their passive effects and the extra effects tacked onto their class abilities, you get to replace a lot of things that other classes have to pull from other sources, such as the Fighters Guild line or things like that. And because of that, stamina DPS wise, I can't speak too much for the Magicka one, but for stamina DPS, it's basically easy street as far as that goes because they've incorporated so many of those other things just into their normal class stuff. Magicka abilities, I haven't actually played too much with a Magicka Templar, so I mean, take it with a grain of salt. While all this stuff's definitely there, I can't help but feel like just looking at the abilities and stuff that Sorcerers and Nightblades have an easier way to go. Now, that said, Magplar is still a very popular class attribute combo, if you will. You still definitely see them a lot. They're just, as far as the casters go, they're probably the least popular of the classes. At least in my personal opinion. I mean, if you see people use them every day, by all means, do it up. That said, I don't see a lot of Magicka Templars running around, but that's just me personally. And then their tanks, because of the extra healing abilities and the fact that their healing abilities, like the Rune Focus thing, which gives them all that extra resistance, plus minor protection, and reduces damage taken and things like that, because they have that healing tree that they can kind of pull from, as well as all the Aedric Spear stuff, which basically increases the amount of damage they can block and things like that. They make great Templars, or they make great tanks because they're so sturdy. So, I mean, that's pretty much all I've got to say on them. Stamina DPS, like I said, definitely easy street. They make great healers. Again, at least in my opinion, they don't seem to be a very popular choice for Magicka builds, but I mean, the stuff's there. You can do it. It'll be fun as anything else is. And then tanks, again, pretty solid. Everyone still tends to prefer Dragon Knight, though, because Dragon Knight is easy street for tanks. So, with all that said, that's my general pros and cons for the Templar, guys. If you disagree or you just want to voice your opinion, by all means, put it down in the comments below. But if you liked the content, by all means, subscribe. But thank you so much for watching either way. See you next time.